I've always been interested in genealogy, and in 2020, after doing years of research, I put everything I'd found together and made a family history of my wife Julie's ancestors and my ancestors. Not long afterwards, Julie's mum's cousin Joan told us the family was connected to Florence Nightingale, also known as the Lady with the Lamp. Obviously, I'd missed something when I'd done all that research, so I set out to investigate these claims myself, and in this video I'm going to show you what I found. The link to Florence Nightingale apparently comes when you go back to the 1600s. Florence Nightingale was born on the 12th of May 1820. She was born in Florence when her family was touring Italy. She had an older sister called Frances Parthenope, and their parents were William Edward Shaw and Frances Fanny Smith. William Edward Shaw was the son of another William Edward Shaw and Mary Evans, so Mary Evans was Florence Nightingale's grandmother. Now, Mary Evans was born in Cromford in Derbyshire in the year 1760. Her father was called George Evans and her mother was called Anne Nightingale. Anne Nightingale's parents were Peter Nightingale and Anne Cheetham. Anne's brother was a mining entrepreneur, Peter Nightingale Jr. After Peter Nightingale Jr. died, William Shaw, Florence Nightingale's father, inherited the Lea Hall estate in Derbyshire and assumed the name and arms of Nightingale. So William Shaw became William Nightingale, and that's why his daughter Florence was called Florence Nightingale. So if we continue working back through the generations, Florence Nightingale's father was William, William's mother was Mary, Mary's mother was Anne, and Anne's father was Peter Nightingale Sr. Now, Peter Nightingale Sr. was born in 1705. He was the son of Thomas Nightingale and Catherine Bowler of Lea. Thomas Nightingale was baptised in Ashover, a village in Derbyshire, on the 25th of March 1666. The records show that this Thomas Nightingale, known as Thomas Nightingale of Lea, had two brothers, Henry and Richard, and they were the three sons of John and Frances Nightingale. The three brothers were all baptised at Ashover. At first, Thomas Nightingale was a servant to a farmer called John Marshall at Lindway Lane. He worked hard and earned money by lead mining. Later on, he bought and inherited land and property in Lea, and by the end of the 1600s, he owned lots of land. The furthest back we can get for sure is to this Thomas Nightingale's father, John, known only as John Nightingale of High Reddish. He died in 1708 and was buried at Ashover. Remember this later on, but now let's come back to the present day and start with Julie. Julie Ann Green, her maiden name, was born in 1969. Her parents, Dennis Green and Susan Wheeldon. Susan's parents were Ernest Oxley Wheeldon and Florence or Florrie Sutcliffe. The line back to the Nightingales comes through Julie's granddad, Ernest Oxley Wheeldon. Though he ended up living in Littleborough, Julie's granddad, Ernest Oxley Wheeldon, originally came from Derbyshire. He was one of 7 children. There was Hilda, Maria, Bertha, Dora, Ernest Oxley, Eva and Richard. Sadly, 2 of the children, Maria and Richard, died when they were babies. They have a grave which is marked with their initials in the graveyard at St Helen's Church in Darley-Dale. Ernest Oxley's parents were Ernest Wheeldon and Hannah Haslam. The Wheeldons lived at Brookside Cottages in Twodales. During the First World War, Ernest Oxley's eldest sister Hilda got engaged to a Canadian soldier called Richard Lacey. He'd been injured in the war and he had come to Matlock in Derbyshire to recover. When he was sent back to Canada afterwards, he hoped Hilda would follow him, but her parents Ernest and Hannah wouldn't let her go. Then she discovered she was pregnant. Before the baby was born, the Wheeldon family left Twodales and went to live 60 miles away in Littleborough in Lancashire, probably to avoid scandal. When the baby was born, his grandparents Ernest and Hannah raised him while Hilda went out to work. The baby was named Richard Lacey Wheeldon after his father, but apparently any mail Hilda sent to his father in Canada was confiscated, so Richard Lacey never found out that he even had a son. Now, Julie's granddad Ernest Oxley Wheeldon's mother Hannah Haslam was born in Chesterfield in 1877. Her father was a farmer called George Haslam and her mother was called Jane Hardy. George Haslam was born at Knott Cross Farm in Ashover in 1850. His parents were Job and Anne Haslam. Job Haslam was also a farmer. Now, Hannah Haslam had a sister called Sarah. Before the two girls were born, their parents George and Jane also had a little boy called Henry. But tragically, Henry died when he was just a year and 11 months old. He was walking backwards when he was playing with a wooden horse and he fell into a panchion of scalding water which his grandmother had put down. And he was so badly scalded that he died the next day. Julie's third great-grandparents then are Job and Anne Haslam, and they lived at Yew Tree Farm in Tansley. They're buried together at Holy Trinity Church in Tansley. Anne Haslam appears to have suffered greatly during her life. She died of paralysis when she was 67, and under her name on the headstone it says, "With pain I was so long oppressed, which wore my strength away, and made me wish for endless rest that never will decay." Job Haslam died of senile decay 7 years after her. Now, coming back, Julie's third great-grandfather, then Job Haslam, was baptised at Ashover, and he was the son of another George Haslam and Mary Cowlishaw. This George Haslam was also baptised at Ashover and was the son of Lydia Milnes and another George Haslam. They lived on Andrew Lane. Lydia Milnes was the daughter of Elizabeth Hodgkinson and James Milnes of Bole Hill, Ashover. And now here comes the connection to the Nightingales. Elizabeth Hodgkinson was born in 1697. Her father was called Edmund Hodgkinson and her mother was, wait for it, yes, her mother was called Anne Nightingale. This Anne Nightingale, Julie's seventh great-grandmother, was baptised at Ashover in Derbyshire on the 29th of March, 1676. She had a brother called Thomas, and her parents were called Richard and Lucy Nightingale. This Richard Nightingale, Julie's eighth great-grandfather, was living in Ashover in Derbyshire at the same time as Florence Nightingale's fourth great-grandfather, John Nightingale of Higho Reddish. Remember him from earlier? Now comes the complicated business of officially linking these two men together in some way. The main theory is that John and Richard were brothers. That could very well be. After all, they certainly appear to be of the same generation. John died in 1708 and Richard died in 1723. Now, Ashover was the scene of a confrontation between the Royalists and Roundheads during the English Civil War in the 17th century. When the Roundheads ran out of ammunition, they demolished the windows of the parish church and used the lead to make bullets. They also burned the parish registers because they believed it was papist idolatry, so sadly there is a gap in baptism record at Ashover, and the gap happens to be from 1623 to 1653, which is the time period in which both John and Richard were born. With no censuses taken at that time, and with no baptism record for either John or Richard, which would tell us their parents' names and secure a link, it's impossible to say for sure. Instead, we have to look for other clues. So what clues do we have? Firstly, we do know that Richard Nightingale had a brother called Thomas. This Thomas was known as Thomas Nightingale of Lindway Lane, and when he died in 1704, he mentioned his brother Richard in his will. In his will, he also mentioned a brother, William Nightingale of Dowhole Lane, and a sister, Anne Hadfield. Also, while he doesn't say they are his nephews, which they would be if John was also his brother, in the same will, Thomas Nightingale of Lindway Lane does refer to the three sons of John Nightingale. Also remember that John's son, Thomas Nightingale, who became Thomas Nightingale of Lee, started off as a servant to a farmer at Lindway Lane, which places him in the same area as Richard and the other Nightingale siblings. He also started off working on a farm like the other Nightingales were trying to connect him with. There was a farmhouse at Lindway Lane, and Richard's brother William Nightingale of Doe Hole Lane was a thresher. Another clue to be found is in the burial record of a Thomas Nightingale of Doe Hole, who was buried in Ashover on the 3rd of February, 1683. It's possible this man was John and Richard Nightingale's father. He's of the right generation, lived in the right place, and both John and Richard had sons named Thomas. Both men could have named their sons after their father. What can I say in conclusion? Well, the exact link isn't absolutely clear, but what is certain is that Julie's family line definitely goes back to the Nightingales of Lindway Lane, and so she is indeed connected to the lady with the lamp, Florence Nightingale.